Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Father Jim Lease, a priest of the Congregation of Holy Cross and the academic lead at Notre Dame's London Global Gateway. I want to thank you for your active participation in this ongoing series called Toward a Sustainable Future. It's the second of 3 lectures in this vein. Each year, the University of Notre Dame selects a theme on which to focus, and the forum theme for the 2021 and 22 academic year is Care for Our Common Home, Just Transition to a Sustainable Future. The ND Forum is intended to mobilize the entire university community globally around questions of environmental justice and sustainability. Today, in this talk, you will hear from Dr. Ellie Cosgrave, who will share her personal experiences of bringing her passions and hobbies into her day job, so to speak, as an urban researcher. She will go on to explore how her own experiences in public spaces growing up led her to bring a feminist perspective to urban design and to policy projects, and what that means in practice. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to thank the Nanovic Institute for European Studies, who have been our co-sponsors for this event, and whose support is a mark of their commitment to discussing both timely and important issues in the European theater. Dr. Ellie Cosgrave is the director of Publica's Community Interest Company and Research. She has over 15 years of experience in leadership and strategic management and is an expert on issues surrounding inclusive urbanization. As an engineer, interdisciplinary researcher, dancer, and trained systems thinker, she is motivated by how scientific endeavor, artistic practice, and policy innovation can combine to create a healthier and fairer society, particularly with respect to gender and just climate transitions. Ellie has conducted research with various policy organizations such as the UN, C40 Cities, NEST, Connected Places Catapult, national and local governments, and has a long history of partnerships with the Greater London Authority. Ellie is an associate professor in urban innovation and policy at the University College London's Department of Science, Technology, and Engineering, and is co-director of UCL's Urban Lab. In addition to her academic work, she's also an advocate and campaigner for increasing the quality of women's health services. She is also a broadcaster and presented the BBC podcast Tomorrow's World, and currently presents the BBC World Service series, My Perfect City.
I wanted to talk with you today is really, hopefully, we can stop at any time, we can have discussions. Maybe that's not in the rules, but that's how I like to work. We all have our own different perspective, our different understanding of what sustainability means, our different understandings of our roles in society, pushing forward climate justice agendas, and our profession and our lives. So I will tell you a bit about my own version of that, but my invitation to you as I'm talking is to reflect on what is your story, what are your influences, what are your creative passions and hobbies that influence and affect what you know about the world and how you think about the world, and also that you maybe sometimes don't always bring to, well, I'm currently in a boardroom, so I'm thinking the boardroom, but into your own work, and allow it, and potentially we can talk about some of the barriers to doing that. I can certainly discuss why that has been difficult in my experience. Okay, let's get into it. So I am gonna spend, I know that was already a very thorough introduction indeed, but I am gonna spend a bit more time dwelling on me, because I think it's part of the process of understanding our own contribution to the world, and then just show you a bit about how that has played out in the choices I've made about the type of research I do and the types of jobs that I do. Both one example is how I think and act as an urbanist, an urban policy advisor in terms of feminist approaches to urban design, and secondly, in my research program, Choreographing the City, where I brought dance artists and engineers together, my favorite people, both of them, both groups. Okay, so yeah, a bit about me. The middle one, I guess the center one there, is my official profession, not lying on the floor next to cartoons of myself. But as an engineer, the ICE is the Institution of Civil Engineers, where I was, where I've been affiliated for a long time, running their thought leadership around inclusive cities. I decided to become an engineer because on top of really enjoying maths and physics, I believed that, and I understood that the way we design our technologies materially affects our lives. I wanted to design cities. I grew up in London, and I understood that the decisions that had been made about my local area, about where the roads go, around where the shops are, around where the transport systems are, defined my life. And I wanted to be part of that. I wanted to be part of being able to do that more sensitively. And I believed then that technology was really, could be more inclusive. I believed that we could invent our way out of a lot of the world's problems. Naive, as I now understand it as an adult. I'm also a dancer. This is a picture of the last dance performance I participated in before the pandemic. So it's a kind of quite a moving photo for me because that all had to stop. I'm in a dance company, non-professional dance company at the place in London. And then, and that's just, it's something that resonates with me. It's something that I find important in my everyday life, moving and connect, and it's how I connect with others, and stress relief and beauty of performance and expression has been really important to me in my life. And on the other side of your screen is an organization called My Body Back Project, which I am the chair of. We are an organization that provides bespoke sexual health services to women who've experienced sexual violence. Predominantly, well, we started off in the smear test industry, and but we provide all sorts of other bespoke healthcare, including maternity care, other sexual health testing, as well as workshops for women to understand how to reconnect with their bodies and sexuality again after violence. And again, something I've been involved in feminist activism pretty much from the beginning, but growing up in London and being a kind of young woman in the workplace, understanding, I guess a lot of my passion and interest was about understanding my own experience. What was it about being catcalled on the way to school, or all sorts of other various degrees of sexual violence that I've experienced in my life? What does that mean for, like, what I desperately was trying to do throughout my 20s and my early research career was explore how can I understand my own experience as it plays out in my work and where I have power in the world. And so, although my PhD was on quite a technical subject in terms of, I was looking at how information technologies were transforming cities, what I really was able to do through my postdoc was, and late subsequent work at the university, was to look at the intersections between what I was learning about feminism and urban development. Trying to be a good speaker and keep checking the time and see how I'm getting on. And so what I'd like to do is just to show you two ways of how both of those blogs have at one time or another intersected with my central professional identity. And I'd like to explain a bit around the feminist concepts of the city. So this is where it will get a little bit more like a lecture. I don't know if that excites you or upsets you, but this is what's going to happen. So I'm just going to run through two basic ideas of feminism, the binary, the gender binary, and the idea of power to and power over and power within, and how they to the ways in which we can think about urban development. Are you in? I'm going to assume there's like, you're quivering with excitement and ready to go. So the binary. I wish I could do some hand raises and things like that to see. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So I'm going to tell you a little story about the binary, and you're going to come along for the ride with me, just so that we get on the same page about how do we understand the binary, not just in gender terms, but in a way that a kind of patriarchy structures the world into binaries. And this is a story about what happens with the binary. So patriarchy structures the world through binaries. We either are men or we are women. We have sense, logic, and reason, or we have sensibility, feelings, or desire. They are two distinct. They are separate from each other. We either have technology or we have nature, separate things in opposition. Science and art, productivity and care, separate things, distinct from each other. I'm trying to change. Okay, then what patriarchy does is code them either masculine or feminine, where feminine becomes the realm of women and masculine becomes the realm of men. So men are men. Men have sense, logic, and reason. Men are the guardians of technology, science, and productivity. And women, we've even coded colors. we know which one's which. The feminine is the realm of women. Women are the ones with feelings and desires. Women are the ones who are custodians and understand nature. They're the deep artists. They are the carers. But what it then does is then positions all the masculine realm as superior and allowed to exert power over the feminine, men over women, logic over feelings, technology over nature, science over art, productivity over care. Even we can think of it as sense over nature. And of course, there are institutions of power and capitalism and colonialism that are associated with their associated institutions. So whether we like it or not, government and big institutions of education and religion are often wielded as mechanisms to reinforce and sustain those. And I also believe, it's my personal belief, that those institutions are where it is possible as well for and necessary for the work to be done to break open those binaries and systems of oppression. So it's a kind of paradox that they are both maybe it's not a paradox, they're the modes of ensuring they stay where they are, but also the modes of breaking it down. Okay, so what does this mean? What does this mean for the world? Well, it means many things from the world, but what it has meant for me in my life and my experience is that women, coded feminine, have been excluded from the realms of science, technology, logic, and productivity. It meant that I didn't necessarily feel I was in the right place when I chose to become an engineer. It means that women are excluded from, more generally, are excluded from professions where they may gain financial capital and therefore power. It means that the needs and realities of women are excluded from technological and urban development. It also means that social and environmental challenges are often set up as scientific or technological problems that can be solved. And it means that because we deem science and technological solutions as superior and more appropriate, that resources that are channeled into global environmental crises often focus on technological solutionism rather than reassessing patterns of consumption or building communities of resilience. It also means where efforts to foster community do exist, they're often under-resourced and seen as peripheral to any other kind of mode of development. The amount of money that's challenged into scientific innovation rather than systems, social systems innovation that may be low tech and paying community members is astounding. There's astounding differences. So how does this play out in the city? There's the theory. What can we see in practice? Well, one binary that we mentioned was productive versus reproductive labor. And if you look at the ways in which our cities are designed, they are designed to from a transport system to optimize access to the paid daytime labor market, which is interesting in a world affected by COVID, how quickly that assumption that we need to get as many people into the center of the city as possible in the morning and as many people out as efficiently as possible in the evening starts to fall apart. This is an image of the London Tube map, which is, I guess, the heaviest, biggest investment infrastructure that we can see. London, I mean, this is a bit of a caricature because, of course, there are quite a lot more circular routes in London that this map shows. But actually, this pattern of transport systems that really focus on getting people to and from work rather than enabling them to do multi-stop journeys in their local area, whether that's to pick up children from school, to go to the shops on the way, carry lots of things, get up, get to where you need to get to, is not currently prioritized and seen as worthy of the big investments as it might be connecting the City of London to Heathrow or things like that. And of course, we can see this, that productive labor is coded masculine and reproductive labor is coded feminine. So in many ways, one solution will be to socially deconstruct the binary and not make reproductive labor simply the realm of women or productive labor simply the realm of men. And of course, work is being done to get there. But if we are going to enable that, then we need to equally invest in the in systems that support reproductive labor. What can we do differently? What's the next slide? Okay. So one thing that we can do differently, this is a picture of a park in Vienna, and Vienna has had over the last 30 years a gender mainstreaming policy with an associated department in city government whose responsibility it has been to ensure that we kind of understand gender dynamics of public space and start to do something about it. So I don't know if many of you will have heard of this example. It's something that in the sector, in the kind of feminist city sector, is used as an example a lot of the time. So first thing that they try to do in Vienna is to understand what are the gender dynamics of spaces. So they do what you might think you should do, which is collect data to understand. And what they were finding in their public parks was that up until about the age of 8, boys and girls seemed to be using city parks at about the same rate. But after the age of 8, the usage by girls just dropped, faced a nosedive. And what they understood about that was that once children get to the age where they kind of do larger group activities, bigger sports, things like active sports games, where in public spaces where the space has to be socially negotiated, the bigger, faster kind of traditionally activities done by boys, such as football or basketball, that took up more space, often won out, and there was no space left for activities that girls tended to be encouraged into more often. So what they decided to do was to create specific areas of parks that would enable different multiple types of activities, so that there was a designated space for football, basketball, and a designated space for other types of activities that involve talking or creative and craft activities. And once they did that, they found that usage of the park immediately returned to a 50-50 split. And I wonder, you might be thinking, well, does that really break down the gender binary? Does creating segregated spaces for women, for girls' activities and boys' activities, take us in the direction that we want to go in? I would suggest not. I suggest it's not the whole part of the story. What this does is enable access to the current gender split to public space. What it doesn't do is start to deconstruct who gets to play football and who gets to sit and read and talk. And so clearly we need to layer onto that social programs that enable and support access to different types of activities. So you may, for example, so there's been some studies to show that if you do have a 1 hour a week where it's an invitation only for girls to use the football pitch, that you see a trend that those girls are more likely to feel confident using that space in their non-hour that has been laid aside for them. So it's clear that we need to activate spaces through social programs as well, and that public space design can't be the full story. But this is a story of how having more data and understanding feminist theory can help change decisions about your public space to make them more inclusive. The next thing that I wanted to talk on, and it's another little story about power, the power to and power over, which you may have heard of before. But I think there are these intermingled concepts about the city that it's useful to get to grips with, and I'll try and do this briefly. I think power is about having a sense that you can make change in the world. Control is that you have a sense of being able to use that power in order towards a specific direction. And rights is about meeting basic agreed upon fundamental human needs. And there's a really important and great theory about the city called the right to the city, developed by Lefebvre and then built upon by David Harvey. And the right to the city is described as this: the right to the city is far more than an individual liberty to access urban resources. It is the right to change ourselves by changing the city. It is moreover a common rather than an individual right, since this transformation depends upon the exercise of collective power to reshape the process of urbanization. I think there are so many important themes about that are inherent in here. One, that it's that this our need to change our environment is about ourselves. It's about the idea that the city itself forms our lives, and that we should have a right to reform that in order to reform our lives, and that this also should be a collective endeavor. This is not an individual human right, but this is about how can we create a sense that it's not only one type of person who has power to reshape, but all of us having this collective power to reshape. And just to this is, in fact, a critique of David Harvey has been that he kind of leaves out women in it. It's very much comes from a sort of workers, it comes out of Marxist thinking. And so over the last 10 years, that there have been moves to look at what a feminist right to the city is and what that means. So I'm going to take you on this very quickly because I do want to speak about choreography as well. And so it's important to acknowledge that, okay, we all have power over things. We have, I want to reinforce is that having power over something is not inherently a bad thing. It is a truth. There are power dynamics at play all the time. Sometimes we're at on an end of it we don't enjoy. So it may sound briefly that I don't like power control, but we just have to go there in order to get out the other end. And so there are ways in which urban designers and policymakers hold or wield power over the city. We can see that in the way that, companies that I work in, for example, have the power over design of public space. Governments and policing systems can have power over surveilling public space that maybe individuals don't have. We can prosecute perpetrators of violence. There are people who have power over funding and financing and political priorities. But a power, control, and right to do something is much more about the right and power and control to move freely and safely, to access work, to tell our stories and speak out and be heard, to create community programs and be happy and healthy. And of course, as we've seen before, gender dynamics affect both of these areas. So it affects who has power to reimagine and remake the city. And we know that professions that tend to have more power over the city are male dominated. These are things like policymakers, engineers, urban designers, policing tend to be people with more of the levers of the power over. And gender dynamics also affect who has power to access different parts of the city. So we know that women and trans people often avoid empty streets or dark places. Their testimony is often taken less seriously. We know this as well from the perspective of racial dynamics. Black women who report sexual violence crime, sexually violent crime are more likely to be no crimed than their white counterparts. And women generally have more limited access to funds, and due to the gendered natures of care work, often less time to invest in programs that might help them exert their power too. And I think I just want to see, this is an image from the Sarah Everard vigil that was obviously quite well renowned at this point, but it has been interesting to me that the response to high profile murders in London has been very much a power over response. We have seen commitments to, redouble policing and really not much else in terms of investing in communities of care or liberty for women who violence. And I just think that's a kind of interesting dynamic. What do we believe is the strongest way to approach issues of sexual violence in the city? I can sympathize with people like this, feeling the need that they must act tough on sexual violence, but really then we just flip back into our traditional binaries and look at kind of male dominated systems of protecting women. The men come in and control and protect, which is really not doing much for communities of resilience, in my view. And so there is a need to rebalance this power over and power to. So it looks more like this. And of course, there are many dimensions to that. So what does that look like? Well, this is a seating area that was co-designed with teenage girls in a city called Umeå. And really the designers of this space are really the people who traditionally have power over it, right? So they're the ones who could say what is going where. And what they were able to do through this co-design process was to say, okay, so what do you want for the space, and really design around the stories of local teenage girls. And what they said that they wanted was a well-lit space, but not floodlit, so that it should feel kind of warm and inviting, but so they could be really clear and see what was going on. They wanted a sense that they could always see out, both for, for a variety of reasons, but there are really clear sightlines about what's going on, and that within a friendship group, someone's got their eye everywhere. and that it also should be playful and a space of joy and comfort. And I think this is a really beautiful living material image of what can happen when you take away a bit of your power over and give it to young women. Okay, and there are also more technical tools, which I won't go into in terms of, this is an idea around gender budgeting, which is to say that equity is not about spending the same amount or investing the same amount in everyone, rather investing so that everyone can meet the same needs. So this is a kind of rights-based, inclusion-based approach to urban development, which might mean that it's legitimate to spend 20 times more in providing access for a disabled person than providing access for someone who already can freely access an area. Okay. We've got enough time. So it's interesting to me. I always felt that my choreographing the city work and my feminist city work were two just separate parts of me that I just brought on separate projects, and largely through the last sort of 5 years of my career, I've advanced them as kind of individual separate projects. And I'm going to talk to you about one project just for 2 minutes before I close. But what I have found is that much of the feminist literature about embodiment and sense and connecting with self and one another is something that choreography, that is inherent in dance making and choreography, and kind of trusting one's body. And so I think it's interesting that I have chosen over the last 5 years to work with dancers in an urban context, because I think it's very much a participative feminist embodied approach to thinking about urban development. So for this project, my core inquiry is, how do we as engineers need to be different in order to create livable cities? What is it about us that keeps missing the mark in terms of what we're prioritizing in urban space and how we design traffic systems and all those sorts of things? My idea was that as engineers, we tend to focus on functionality, efficiency. Again, we're quite technocratic in terms of it's always about a technological solution. We like to reduce things into parts and put them back together and make them work. We work in projects and often quite resource intensive. And my curiosity was, is there a practice, a design practice that offers a new light into these things? And what I found, what I decided to do was to bring dancers and engineers together into public space to talk about their design process. And the way I did this, I match made, and so we took pairs of one choreographer and one engineer, and we went out into public space, and I asked them 3 questions. Firstly, what do you see? So I was interested in what they felt was important about this space. What was it that they were attracted to? Second question was, what are the possibilities that you see for this space? What do you imagine you have power over or power to? And finally, what could you start designing? And how would you go about designing an intervention? This is just a picture from a different choreography public space workshop that I did. I do have a video from the other interviews, but it doesn't really work on a webinar, I have found from previous talks. I'll just give you a couple of insights into what I heard from the different perspectives of dancers and engineers. And the first thing was about their perceptions of what safety is. And it was interesting that the engineers were absolutely focused on safety. And bearing in mind, we were usually at a point of high traffic or a transport interchange where there are lots of pedestrians. So it's understandable as an engineer that you are super concerned about that everyone is safe. This is a huge engineers. And generally, the way that they approached it was to put in barriers. They would segregate spaces so that pedestrians and cars and hopefully cyclists kind of quite literally stayed in their lane. So it was a real focusing on as control as providing safety. But interestingly, in quite a different way, the dancers also were quite interested in safety, but they thought about it in quite a different way. They were thinking much more along the times of safety as being able to bring people to attention in that space. One dance artist said, how can I let pedestrians know that they are part of the dance, was her inquiry. And so for me, that's about how can I let you know that you are part of the city, that you are part of this process we're making together, and that your choices matter. It was about, one dance artist talked about, okay, we're in Euston Station and everyone was looking up at the boards. And he said, we need to bring the eye line down because actually it's about focusing and connecting with one another. And maybe if we had more of our peripheral vision to hand, we wouldn't be so annoyed about people getting in each other's way. And then quite a few dance artists were also interested in personal safety as having a sense of your own power to be in the space as you would like. And so they were interested in creating opportunities for transgression as an act of personal safety. So they were looking at, how can I encourage people to do things like jump over a fence, which is absolutely horrifying to the engineer's worldview about what a safe city might look and feel like. I think that's enough. I can talk about some other findings later if that is of interest, but I think it's worthwhile perhaps opening up in a moment to a bit of your own reflections. Of course, we can focus on some of the things I've said, but also I'd be delighted to hear about how you have brought different parts of your life into your work. But where I would like to end is from a quote that is so meaningful to me and that I have used really throughout my life to help me stay on course, to do things that I believe in and that I'm excited by, but that is that I have a fear will place me on the outside of my profession. Talking about a feminist city to a bunch of blokey engineers who I love is a personal challenge in terms of who I might be perceived as amongst my colleagues. Talking about dance is even worse. Asking, the amount of times that people are on board with choreographing the city until I suggest they come along to a workshop and say, no, thought it was a metaphor. So this quote has helped me in all sorts of ways to follow, remind me of what I believe in, and to help me when I have writer's block. So this is from Martha Graham, who I guess one mother of contemporary dance. And she's talking about creative practice. And she describes that in creative practice, there is a vitality, a life force, an energy, a quickening that is translated through you into action. And because there is only one of you in all of time, this expression is unique. And if you block it, it will never exist through any other medium and it will be lost. The world will not have it. It is not your to determine how good it is, nor how valuable, nor how it compares with other expressions. It is your business to keep it yours, clearly and directly, to keep the channel open. This is the key bit for me. You do not even have to believe in yourself or your work. You have to keep yourself open and aware to the urges that motivate you. And I'll stop sharing.
I hope this is the beginning of a conversation all over the place. I mean, this is relatively new to me, I will admit it, but I have a great love for urban architecture and planning. because of the impact that it has on us and the way we live together. I love the image of the dancers saying, how do we create a space in which the pedestrian can join the dance? I mean, that is just such a lovely image. I'm going to jump to some of our questions. Some are a little more pragmatic and some a little more ethereal, but I'm going to start with the one that came in early, and it sort of anticipated that image of the two young women, the teenagers sitting on the suspended sort of swing. And she asked, how can we make the design of public spaces for women be more friendly? Does this also include safety measures like lighting? So she hadn't seen that yet, and this seems to point to that, but what's your say on that?
Yeah, there are so many things that we can do. It's almost endless. I have another presentation, which is like the top 10 things you can do. And just like those are 1,001 things you need to see before you die, or those book series. I don't know.
Yes,
maybe
yes.
that's a bit dated, but I actually have 11 ideas in it because we could keep going. But yes, lighting is one thing that it comes up in terms of something that we can do in how to create better feeling of spaces without too much kind of material change. However, that doesn't mean just more lighting. It doesn't mean just switch all the lights on. There are all sorts of considerations that we need to think about. I mean, apart from environmental considerations, the city is a place of tension, of multiple needs coexisting in any one space. So you can't floodlight a whole area because people live in that area and people need to go to sleep because of our protection of the night sky and the stars and the sense of wonder that we need to experience, because of ecosystems and birds who also share the cities with us. We need to start to be sensitive about the ways in which we think about solutions. And of course, once we start saying lighting is the solution, where do you stop in terms of which streets are lit? Because the more you light, say, in a high street, so it almost feels like daytime, midnight, sometimes that can make side streets feel darker. So even though the side streets might be lit very well, if you've got a really well lit or highly lit main high street, is going to be perceived as dark when it's not. You can kind of think when you switch the light on in the morning, it's like the brightest thing you've ever been, and you come in 2 hours later, you're like, no, it's super dark. So our perceptions of lighting. So there are material things that we can do in public space, and we can do lots of design. But that's the way we think about it in terms of what we can do to the city. I think a lot of the stuff that I advocate for is something that is surprisingly done so little is to speak to women and take their testimony seriously about the spaces that they actually live in. And I think that part of the reason we avoid it is because we're not that confident in speaking to communities always, especially when we don't absolutely have to. And so what a lot of the way that I'm advocating is like women's safety audits, where as a group of women who maybe live and work in a local area, have a kind of roaming workshop around the space to discuss what are your experiences of this place, where are the joyful spaces, where are the places people feel scared, what is it about that space? And so we can start to develop a nuanced debate amongst people who are expert because they live there, because they understand the community dynamics. They know the character down the street who's always there, who may be a safety figure or a scary figure, and that we can have nuanced and interesting conversations with that and work from there. A lot of the time when we think of an audit, we can think of these kind of apps that are like the safety mapping apps, and they are great in one sense, but what they don't allow for is a nuanced discussion. So, for example, one person might see a group of 14-year-old boys who are in hoodies, maybe they're black, in public space. What do we signify? Depending on who we are, it will what we see happening there is different. And so if you rely on reporting apps that are generally kind of middle class women. What are they seeing, and then are you targeting? Are you targeting a kind of certain type of activity? It doesn't. What we need to be able to do is hold those conversations with more nuance and debate and discussion, rather than sort of as true data in themselves.
There's another very interesting question here, Ellie, that's related, but takes it just a little bit further. Do you think safety is a useful lens through which to approach city planning? And then goes on, or could it lead to more restrictive or harming measures like anti-homelessness architecture over policing? Would you suggest an alternative approach policymakers can use?
So that is super interesting and something I'm very passionate about. And I think what the assumption behind the question is safety is crime. And I think certainly taking a police and crime approach to women's safety and experience in the public realm is incredibly limited for all sorts of reasons about efficacy of policing. Well, there are just so many that we could get into. So I don't think a crime-only approach to thinking about inclusive design is appropriate. What I do think, I mean, it's interesting terminology, right? So I would gender inclusive, understanding that there are multiple experiences of and multiple needs of spaces, and that we should be working out like complex and nuanced ways as to go through that. However, that doesn't really land with lots of people. They're like, okay, cool, what are you on about? So when you go in with women's safety, there is something that people get and are interested in. It starts a conversation. However, when I'm talking about women's safety, it's often in very different terms to how it might be, other people might be, who maybe have a crime-based approach. And so when I talk about women's safety, I think about a sense of participation, a sense of a community, a sense of belonging in space. And that we have to remember that we are, as human beings, we're affected by our perceptions, not our knowledge of crime statistics. So there could have been no violent act, no harassment in this street ever. My perception, which I gained through my own previous experience of space elsewhere, through media, through what my parents have told me about what is an appropriate thing for me to be doing or wearing or going, these all feed into my sense of safety. And it's my sense of safety that materially affects my life, not crime statistics.
You appear to have anticipated the next question, but it's so compelling, I have to get it in here. I'm actually going to rely on two questions. The first, how do you conceptualize the relationship between cultural and physical change in urban environment, or physical change in urban space? Thinking about everyday street harassment, for example, which is more prevalent in some cities than others, and as you say, some streets more than others. Can changes in the built environment generate cultural change? And then the next question just says, is there a spiritual dimension to such pragmatism and a sense of benevolence in it?
Brilliant questions. I was doing a talk today on public space imagery around sexual harassment, and it was an advertising industry who were hosting that. And I was there because of the way you advertise in public space. And their question was, hey, why haven't we done more as an advertising industry to support progress towards gender justice? And B, why do we think a campaign can solve this? And I think so often when we are thinking about our role in big, complex social societal change, a voice in our head can say, what are you going to do? Why do you think your industry is so going to solve this? And I think in one sense, that is appropriate in terms of, no, I'm not going to solve this by putting a bench in, or the right public art, or the right community conversation around ownership of public space. but it's one dimension of our society and shaping our society. And I believe that the processes by which we make our cities are important, and that having high quality public space material affects people's lives, and it deserves attention in terms of, are we doing this right, or are we reproducing things that we don't believe in? And so the more straightforward answer to that is either no and or yes and. No, well, yes. That wasn't a straightforward answer, was it? But I would say that a public space intervention must be connected to interventions around programming in that space, as much as it needs to be education and policy changes, as much as it needs to be transformation in policing systems, as much as it needs to be our HR issues at work, and that if we can see what, I mean, oh my gosh, one example could be like reporting, asking more women to report. Fine, ask more women to report, but what's their experiences of reporting going to be? What impact is the data that you're going to have on your ability to make decisions, and how does this all fit together in a piece of pie? So yes, putting a lighting scheme, but also making sure that we're signaling local women, and that we are signaling what the other services. So it's all connected.
That's great. There are two remaining questions, and we'll take them very briefly as we're running to the end of the hour.
Didn't answer the spiritual one either. Just
we'd love to hear from that. So why don't you take that up, and if we can't get these, we'll carry on.
So for me, personally, there is, of course, a spiritual dimension, because of the way that I take this work. So acknowledge the personal dimension of this work, because this is me. And because this is me, it matters. And that's absolutely joyful and devastating in the same way. And if it weren't for having of course, I guess we may need to define what spirituality means. But if we take the broadest definition, as I understand it, there is a sense of a connection to some great mystery of that lives through us as human beings and our decisions that we choose to make every day. And obviously for a lot of us, that means having a spiritual structure in which to support us in community. And I work as much on building up that structure so I can be resilient to go into it, but also to remember what it's all about.
Well, I'm glad you put that forward. I think that's a fitting end, and God forbid the priest should have stopped you from being able to say that. So I'm really grateful for your time with us, Ellie. It's such a pleasure to just really hear from you. And you said you've got another, some other talks you're giving. Things we might pull you back. You be careful. Anyway, as we close, I want to thank all of those who continue to support our Towards a Sustainable Future series, those who've attended and those who have yet to. We're just very excited that you're here. I also want to do a shout out again to the Nanovic Institute for European Studies for their support, and the backroom team, Joe Byrne, Tom Finch, and Idil Omar, for the work they're doing to support me in making sure I don't look like a hodl, and Ellie, so that we can manage this whole thing. Finally, Ellie, to you, your thoughtful and really fine lecture. And really, it's so thought-provoking and so important, I think, in this time. And when we live in this magnificent international capital, I mean, we can see some of the things you're talking about everywhere. And it's kind of exciting to think that we can learn more from you and from what you do. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
All right.